A moment arrives, often unnoticed, where the journey so many quietly chase finally crosses an invisible border. At first, it seems like another ordinary shift, a subtle pivot in the pattern of days. Yet beneath the surface, something monumental gives way, like a tide slipping out before dawn. On the calendar, a new season is marked, but in reality, the transition is less about cosmic clocks and more about a kind of personal unveiling. There is an instinct that, beneath all the searching, something unspoken is about to be revealed, not because a chapter is closing, but because the search itself is beginning to dissolve. Has anyone else ever noticed that the most profound thresholds never announce themselves? This journey doesn't forget you. Subscribe to stay on the path. After the noise of the quest settles, a hush falls that feels almost unfamiliar. Imagine standing at the edge of a field after the storm. No more thunder, no more chase, just the echo of former urgency softening into a new quiet. In that space, the old habit of looking for answers is replaced by an awareness that the pursuit itself was the real teacher. It's easy to believe that a journey is finished when the struggle ends, but what if, instead, it's only now that all becoming begins? The mind wants an explanation, but sometimes the heart recognizes a shift that words can't quite name. There's an undercurrent, rarely spoken aloud, in this phase of transformation. It's a stage hidden from the common scripts, the one where many drift, circling the same patterns. The need for constant confirmation, the magnetism of unresolved questions, the carousel of meaning-making that becomes its own maze. The mistake is to equate turmoil with advancement, as if motion were always progress. When an inner season changes, the energy is no longer about disintegration. Instead, it's an unseen architecture quietly solidifying. If anyone's ever felt like their life was repeating on a loop, isn't it strange how repetition can sometimes be a mask for resistance to the unknown? Sometimes, an unexpected realization sneaks in. What once felt like striving now feels more like presence. Growth continues, but it's no longer about chasing. The dance of self-justification, the effort to signal depth, starts to lose its urgency. The person once enthralled by ideas of transformation now lives in a subtler alignment, no longer compelled to broadcast internal shifts or to persuade anyone, even themselves, of their evolution. Isn't it odd how, at a certain point, change stops being a headline and becomes more like the background music of existence? The surprise comes not in fireworks, but in an unusual hush. The disarray that once signaled movement fades, leaving a remarkable silence. Not the absence of problems, but a kind of tranquil clarity, a backdrop of peace that settles where chaos once thrived. Questions that once haunted the quiet now feel less urgent. Curiously, that stillness isn't hollow. It's a sense of finally arriving, even if no one sent a map. Have you ever caught yourself waiting for the next storm, only to discover the sky has finally cleared? There's a strange paradox that surfaces next. The expected reward for all this inner work isn't a neatly wrapped peace, but rather a restless energy, a peculiar agitation that feels like a skin outgrown. Familiar escapes offer no comfort, the old remedies seem empty. What emerges is not the urge to heal or strive, but a raw tension that marks a boundary between identities. This overlooked experience, seldom discussed, is the signal that the inner landscape has changed so much, there's nowhere familiar left to run. What follows is a kind of limbo, a gap where pursuits that once brought meaning simply dissolve. Purpose seems to evaporate, replaced by an unsettling sense of floating between realities. The external challenges have receded. Now, all that remains is a confrontation with the self, stripped of distractions. No more dramatic crises to solve, no more illusions to shatter, only the unfiltered presence of thought, feeling, and self-awareness. Many people panic in this space, misunderstanding it as failure. But could it be that this emptiness is actually the first true foundation for something lasting? Healing was never meant to be the finish line. It was only the clearing of the path before something far more demanding began. It was the shedding of weight, not the building of strength. And now, with this shift in motion, every delay in stepping into the present becomes a form of resistance. It's not that anything is wrong. It's that the noise is gone, and what's left is the unfamiliar sound of inner stillness. The mind, so used to chasing storms, feels uneasy in calm weather. But isn't that telling? That peace feels more dangerous than chaos? What most call stagnation is often just the absence of old distractions. It's not a lack of movement, it's a silent invitation to finally arrive. Not at a destination, but at the threshold of something original. The edge of a life that no longer echoes old versions. So why does it feel uncomfortable? Perhaps because losing the roles once played by others also dissolves the stage where they were needed. What's left is a life not built around attachment but around presence. And maybe, just maybe, that's what growth always intended. That quiet detachment showing up in daily life, it's not disconnection. It's the subtle collapse of illusions. Words begin to sound hollow. Familiar gestures feel forced. Trust, once given out freely, retreats back to instinct. It's not betrayal. It's clarity. And in this clarity, there's a strange grief, the kind that arises not from loss but from outgrowing the need to explain why things no longer fit. Could it be that what feels like separation is actually reunion, with a self no longer willing to perform? This season isn't interested in how well one can blend in. It's allergic to filters, allergic to polished personas. In this light, only what's genuine can remain. The moment feels sharp because it's cutting through the layers that once protected but now suffocate. It's not anxiety, it's recognition. The body, once curled for protection, starts to uncurl. Spaces that once felt safe now feel tight, not because something changed, but because masks are heavier once they're no longer required. This, perhaps more than any other sign, reveals a turning point, the end of needing to be seen to feel real. The former hunger for belonging begins to fade. The echo chamber grows quiet. And what replaces it is a kind of presence that doesn't beg for reflection in others. Evolution doesn't come with applause, it comes with silence. Not the silence of loneliness, but of stabilization. No longer tossed around by reactions. No longer shaped by what isn't true. There comes a moment when proximity is no longer enough. When it's more nourishing to sit with absence than to crowd oneself with half-truths. Not everyone is meant to come. Not everyone is meant to stay. And in this thinning of the crowd, something strange happens. Space opens. Not just physically but emotionally, energetically. The kind of space where the right people can finally enter. The ones who don't need translation. The ones who aren't threatened by intensity. The ones who understand without needing explanation. The shift begins within long before the skin catches on. Consciousness can erupt like a flash, flooding the interior with insight, with emotional clarity, with sudden expansions of awareness that feel like waking up from a dream. But the physical frame doesn't move at the speed of thought. It lingers. It lags. While the inner realm pivots overnight, the outer shell takes its time, adapting molecule by molecule. Most never speak about this delay, the strange lag between realization and embodiment. But hasn't it felt like the body has been dragging behind, reluctant to let go of old ways of being? And then, almost without warning, the recalibration starts. Something in the atmosphere thickens, like an unseen pulse pressing in. What felt like mental clarity is now showing up in bone-deep fatigue. Dreams become dense or vanish entirely. Foods that once offered comfort now carry weight. The skin speaks in signals, itch, breakouts, tension. The spine wants to shift, the shoulders refuse to hold what they once bore. What explains this? It's not malfunction. It's response. The exterior is just now beginning to echo the transformation the psyche already knew was real. Even more curious are the subtle internal tremors that make no logical sense. Little flashes in the limbs, phantom aches, an electric rhythm flickering beneath the skin. Not illness. Not malfunction. More like an invisible wiring is being updated to accommodate a new voltage. When resonance changes, the vessel must realign. And isn't it wild how heat, the kind that normally signals danger, can, in this context, mean rebirth? The slow-burning kind that doesn't scorch but melts layers that no longer fit. The reshaping is physical, yes, but not cosmetic. It's cellular. Old blueprints stored in muscle, in memory, in organ systems begin to dissolve. Suddenly the body craves things it once rejected and resists what once thrilled it. The gut rebels. The nervous system grows choosy. Simplicity becomes desirable, even sacred. It's not about performing health or chasing some polished image, it's about instinctively stepping away from what deadens and toward what clarifies. What if that shift isn't discipline at all, but recognition? Sensitivity increases, not fragility, but precision. The external no longer dictates rhythm. The body, once ignored, begins whispering instructions. No declarations. No charts. Just tiny shifts, a skipped indulgence, a midday stretch, a random craving for stillness. No one announces it, but it's happening. The compass has changed location, from external validation to inner temperature. Isn't it strange how the body knows before the mind does? That the hands reach for peace before the brain realizes chaos no longer fits? Eventually, a deeper silence arrives. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of seeking. There's a notable quiet where once there were patterns, signals, cosmic breadcrumbs. Remember when everything used to feel loaded with meaning, times, lyrics, strangers' words? As if life was decoding itself just for one person to catch up? That intensity fades, not because something's wrong, but because that training phase ends. The signs stop screaming once the message has been integrated. Why scream when a whisper will do? This quiet unnerves many. They assume absence. They fear abandonment. But the deeper reality is something else entirely. That hush means intimacy. The connection runs so deep, so internalized, that the universe no longer needs megaphones to be heard. It's all internal circuitry now. And under this solar alignment, the internal spark becomes the guiding force. Not fireworks. Not serendipity. Just a knowing, quiet and sharp, that arises without demand. Eventually, the dialogue with the cosmos becomes one-sided, in the best way. The need to ask vanishes. The need to check disappears. The rhythm of the day feels synced to an inner tide that no longer requires outside confirmation. That, in truth, is what trust really is. Not a chant or a request, but a state. A hum. A low, steady frequency that replaces the high-pitched anxiety of needing proof. This isn't spiritual distance, it's integration. And if that's the case, then maybe the silence isn't a void. Maybe it's the echo of arrival. Something changes when the need for symbols fades. There's a soft recalibration of perception, where the hunger for external confirmation dissolves into a kind of presence that doesn't demand to be proved. The signals still arrive, but not like they used to, not with sirens or spectacle. Now they resemble a feeling, a hunch that holds its own authority. When instinct no longer waits to be verified, there's a realization. The moment has come when the signal isn't outside anymore. It's alive within, unshaped and self-evident. For a long time, the compass pointed inward not to guide others, but to piece together fragments of identity. Eventually, that mission outgrows itself. The gaze shifts, not away from self, but beyond it. Inner work doesn't end, it simply stops being the main focus. The lens adjusts, and there's a quiet pivot. The story stops circling around the wound and starts widening towards something else. The search doesn't vanish, but it no longer consumes. Has anyone else felt that strange moment when clarity becomes less about answers, more about stillness? Creation follows. Not the kind rooted in performance, but the kind that grows out of integration. A pull arises, often soft, sometimes untraceable, to share, to shape, to make meaning not because it's owed to anyone, but because it wants to exist. The impulse is less about rescue and more about reflection. And oddly enough, this stage feels more subtle than expected. It's not a trumpet, it's a nudge. A pull to be the echo of something others haven't yet remembered in themselves. No spotlight needed. This isn't about ascending into some pedestal of insight. It's more like returning with a quiet torch after walking through fire. The reason feels ancient, like it didn't begin in this lifetime. Expression isn't for applause now, it's a current that wants to move through. And if it catches someone else in its glow, so be it. There's a particular kind of honesty that arises when the motive isn't influence but service. Have you noticed how realness becomes magnetic when it isn't trying? What emerges isn't drama, it's offering. Something long held back begins to surface. A truth once buried reawakens, not with force, but with familiarity. Long forgotten visions reignite, not for validation, but because they now carry substance. The purpose behind this urge isn't egoic. It's cellular. It's a message that never needed an audience, only permission. And when it moves, it doesn't scream. It roots. It belongs. It's a strange contradiction, isn't it? Most expect purpose to thunder in, but often it walks in quietly, wearing the clothes of routine. A whisper behind how a person shows up at dinner, how they answer a text, how they choose not to argue. The loud identity shifts give way to smaller calibrations, gentle decisions that feel minor but carry weight. Letting go of a persona. Choosing not to perform. There's no title, no applause, only a widening sense of alignment. That's when the mystery reshapes. The mysticism of awakening becomes less electric. Not because anything died, but because the system no longer needs to be shocked awake. That stillness, the one that replaces the endless unraveling, isn't a void. It's absorption. Dishes get done. Bills get paid. And somehow it all feels different. Because now, presence is threaded through each act, like the breath under speech. Normalcy returns, but with new architecture beneath it. Conversations still happen, but the energy around them has shifted. The mind still races sometimes, but it no longer pulls everything off course. This groundedness isn't defeat, it's arrival. And oddly, arrival doesn't look like what was imagined. It looks like showing up to life without needing to be anywhere else. Why is that the part nobody warned about? The absence of noise can feel disorienting. Without signs flashing, without urgency, the soul starts asking unfamiliar questions. Is this all there is? Shouldn't it feel more intense? But the answer hides in the texture of silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but of no longer needing to be reminded. A presence that no longer negotiates for evidence. The message has moved in. Eventually, the big shifts don't rupture, they settle. Instead of dramatic endings and new beginnings, life unfolds like a deep inhale. The chaos that once defined progress gives way to something more solid. Continuity. What once felt like a spiritual sprint becomes a slow dance with ordinary time. And maybe this is the part we never talk about because it's too subtle to sensationalize. But isn't this the real miracle? The true change is not in floating above pain, but in meeting it without flinching. Not in escaping difficulty, but in walking through it without disintegration. And not in chasing awe, but in recognizing beauty in the unfiltered now. It doesn't mean life won't break or sting or surprise. It means presence will remain even when it does. That's not the end of awakening. That's the embodiment of it. There's a subtle but unmistakable shift when the reflex to defend dissolves. Arguments feel less urgent. The space between impulse and action widens. Instead of reacting to misunderstanding, there's observation. Not indifference, but a deeper loyalty to inner balance. This isn't pride disguised as peace. It's discernment. Some connections no longer enter because the threshold has moved, not from distance, but from refinement. The protection isn't for identity anymore. It's for clarity, for that internal atmosphere that's taken years to stabilize. Ever noticed how the quieter a room becomes, the less noise it tolerates? Ordinary moments begin to hold unexpected weight. A silent meal, an eye contact that lasts a beat longer, the way wind moves through trees. All of it strikes deeper because perception no longer sits at the edge. It's moved inward, down into the marrow of things. These aren't grand revelations. They're reminders. That presence doesn't need to be loud to be transformative. And if meaning feels like it's emerging from nowhere, maybe that's because it finally stopped needing permission to arrive. Meanwhile, the external rituals that once defined spiritual connection might start to thin out. Not from neglect, but from evolution. The journaling slows. The incense stays in the drawer. There's no race to interpret every pattern or decode every symbol. What once served as scaffolding is now unnecessary. The depth remains, but it moves differently. It appears in how conversations are held, how patience arises, how stillness is chosen without being forced. The question becomes, what's the point of ceremony if life itself becomes sacred? That sense of return sneaks up gently. Not a dramatic breakthrough, but a quiet settling into one's own rhythm. There's no banner in the sky. No final chant. Just the unmistakable sensation of being able to sit in one's own presence without reaching for distraction. That's the signal. Not that change has stopped, but that it no longer feels like a chase. Growth is now the default setting, not an event. And even though the external world may look untouched, something internal knows the architecture has changed. Can that kind of arrival even be explained? Then comes the most unexpected part, what many never see coming. After all the deconstruction, all the illumination, the last threshold isn't chaos. It's exposure. Not the kind that punishes, but the kind that reveals. When the light shifts, it demands authenticity. Not curated confidence. Not costume wisdom. Just presence. And suddenly, there's nowhere left to perform. The spotlight doesn't ask for polish, it asks for truth. Not a persona, not a label, not a role. Just what's left when the script is dropped. This is where the terrain gets tricky. That lingering urge to be seen as wise, as healed, as elevated, it flares up. A compliment lands, and instead of expansion, it triggers retreat. Why? Because deep down, performance feels safer than vulnerability. And yet, this phase doesn't allow for the old camouflage. It poses a quieter challenge. Can alignment exist without external confirmation? Can truth remain unshaken when others distort it? When the stage is lit and projections begin to fly, can the soul stand there, unpolished, unedited, and still feel whole? That's where the deeper threshold lives. Not in disappearing to avoid scrutiny. Not in exaggerating to stay relevant. But in remaining present, fully and freely, even when misunderstood. The final refinement isn't about adding more, it's about removing the last need to be interpreted. Can presence be enough? Can identity hold without being narrated? Can peace speak louder than performance? These questions aren't rhetorical, they're doorways. And those who walk through them don't just awaken. They arrive. At a certain point, emotional transparency stops feeling necessary. Not because there's shame or fear, but because the emotions themselves no longer ask for outside validation. It's not suppression. It's internalization. The inner world grows still, like a pond that doesn't ripple just because a bird flies overhead. This isn't detachment, it's resonance with a deeper pulse that doesn't need to echo outward. The absence of constant emotional broadcasting doesn't mean the channel's gone quiet. It means it's become private, refined, tuned to a frequency that few even know exists. And maybe that's the point. Maybe not everyone is meant to understand every layer. There's still feeling, there's more of it, in fact, but the expression has changed. The vocabulary has evolved. Fewer words, more silence. Not because emotion is buried, but because it's been distilled. Some will misread this calmness as distance. Others may even resist it, not because it's cold, but because it doesn't feed the chaos they've grown used to. Emotional neutrality, in a reactive world, can look like vacancy. But it's not absence, it's authority. The kind that no longer seeks a stage, because the story no longer needs an audience. Isn't it strange how real power becomes invisible once it no longer seeks permission to exist? This is the era of unspoken depth, where clarity doesn't require conversation, where emotion is no longer projected, it's inhabited. There's a quiet knowing that doesn't need to be explained. That doesn't mean isolation. It means intimacy with one's own process. There's a shift from trying to be heard to simply listening. A kind of internal loyalty that makes misunderstanding feel less personal. Maybe that's the gift, no longer needing others to translate what was never meant to be shared in their language. Could it be that the most honest form of connection is the one that doesn't require translation? None of this happens on command. The transformation isn't scheduled, and it doesn't arrive with ceremony. It unfolds slowly, in uneven spirals. Sometimes it lingers in the body before it registers in the mind. This isn't a checklist to be completed. It's an ongoing change in rhythm. It stops feeling like a race and starts becoming a state. The chase ends not because answers have all been found, but because the questions stopped burning. When presence becomes more compelling than insight, something radical has shifted. Isn't that its own kind of awakening? The current season doesn't ask for movement. It invites recognition. It doesn't amplify noise, it filters it. Instead of launching forward, it grounds. The work isn't in chasing transformation anymore. It's in noticing that it already happened. Not in theory, but in how the day feels, in how choices arise, in how reactions no longer own the moment. The shift isn't external, it's inside the nervous system. Less adrenaline, more breath. Less narrative, more noticing. Isn't it wild how everything changes when nothing on the surface appears to? And now the stillness arrives, the kind that feels both unfamiliar and profoundly earned. Where the internal alarms stop ringing. Where insight doesn't feel like revelation, it feels like recognition. There's no dramatic announcement. Just a steady returning to center. The nervous system no longer jolts when saying no. The chest doesn't tighten when asked to wait. The muscles don't brace for misunderstanding. It's not complacency. It's arrival. And this kind of arrival doesn't announce itself. It becomes the air everything moves through.